All right, we're going to go ahead and start. Welcome everyone to our second Ask a VC webinar. I'm Kirsten Loita of Osage University Partners, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar is a session where people from our academic partner institutions can ask OUP managing partners Marc Singer and Bill Harrington anything and everything as it pertains to venture capital operations, decision-making, investing in university spinouts, and the current investing environment. Many of you already know our two panelists, but I'll have them each provide a brief introduction to themselves. Marc?
Hi, I'm Marc Singer. I'm a managing partner, and I'm responsible for our technology investing at OUP, which includes software companies, hardware companies, energy, and materials.
Great, thanks,
Over to
Marc.
you, Bill.
And I'm Bill Harrington. I manage our life science activities. I'm an MD originally, I guess still, and after spending 14 years at a venture firm focused on healthcare out in Silicon Valley, came out a little over 10 years ago to work with Marc on getting the life science activities here up and running and start to build out our team.
Great. All right, well, I know our audience is really looking forward to hearing from all of you today. Thanks for being here and sharing this hour and a half with us. We'll go to the next slide. So the slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on OUP's partner portal. You can find out how to get there from the information on this slide, and a recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. For those of you who do not know, OUP maintains an online portal for our partner universities that is full of relevant tech transfer content. Once you're in the portal, for which you'll need to register if you haven't already, you'll find a downloadable presentation deck. Actually, this one's a very, very short one, so really just going to find the video, a link to this on our webinars page within the portal, which is under the Startup Resources section of the portal. Since this webinar is titled Ask a VC, the bulk of our time today is going to be dedicated to your questions. We got a ton of questions already, so thanks for everyone for that. So we're going to be answering most of those as we go throughout the day, but also please feel free to add more questions under the Q&A box that should be on your toolbar, your Zoom toolbar here. But for the advanced questions that we received, we ended up grouping those into the following areas: founder and VC relations, VC decision-making, advice for faculty founders and attracting of VC interest, specific sectors and trends within those sectors, license agreement and investment terms, and other topics, which was kind of a catch-all for some of the questions that we had. So like we said, feel free to put any questions into the Q&A at any point during the webinar today. We're going to start off with a brief overview of OUP, which will then lead us into our first topic of how startups and investors connect. So just a brief overview of OUP, as we affectionately call Osage University Partners. We're a venture fund that invests in spinouts from research organizations, usually by exercising participation rights that those organizations may have in those startups. We invest in all stages of spinouts and all sectors that our partners are inventing and forming these startups off of. Our partner institutions have a lot of benefits of working with us. One of those being obviously in sharing our profit, but also through a lot of different value-added resources that we have, including these types of webinars. We are now on our third fund. We have about $600 million across those three funds that we're managing. We've invested in over 125 university spinouts since we started. And a lot of those now have gone on to successfully IPO or be acquired. And I will move on from there to get to our questions because we have a lot of questions today. We're always happy to answer questions about our model as well, though. So with that, we're going to actually stop sharing the deck at this point, because we're just going to show the lovely faces of our panelists to answer the questions today. So the first question that we had for our audience is, what is the most common way you learn about the work of a principal investigator? And Marc, I'll start off with you.
Sure. I'll answer it with two viewpoints. One, how do we learn about the work of a principal investigator at OUP? And outside of that, how does a traditional venture firm learn about it? Because those are similar but have some differences. At OUP, we learn about it first through our partnership with tech transfer offices, where we're constantly engaged with them, trying to learn about the new startups that they're creating. And so if you're a PI using the tech transfer office as a conduit to connect to OUP and other venture investors is a great way to get started. And so we're often doing that. In addition, we are reading publications, so we're reading published research. We're reaching out to PIs directly in areas of investment interest for us. So that's kind of, those are the primary ways we learn about the work of a PI at OUP. More broadly, at other venture firms, there are some similarities, but I would say they may be less connected to tech transfer offices depending on the firm, but they're actively reading research. So one of the ways to attract venture firms is in fact to publish and to use the various support services that a university offers, starting at the tech transfer office and also incubator and accelerator services. They often can be great about connecting PIs to venture capital firms. And then the final way a PI might help connect to venture firms is just through networking, either reaching out directly, which can be time consuming and you won't always get a response from venture firms. It's better to use your network and figure out who in your network knows investors and to go through your network. So those are some of the common ways we connect. Bill, is there anything you would add to that?
The only other thing I would add that may be more relevant on life sciences are the various meetings that are carried out or occur around different disciplines or clinical areas. We and other VCs typically attend those, and those presentations and abstracts are a very efficient way for investors to learn about new technologies and familiarize themselves with some of the work that PIs are doing. So I think, to the extent that you're attending some of these meetings, there are VCs there, and there may be panels and forums where you can make contact directly.
Great, thanks. Marc, next question to you. What should startups look for in their lead investors?
Yeah, there's a long list of what to look for, and in particular, there's kind of what's ideal, and then but the reality is, you wind up in a second camp of what's practical. So let me start with like what's ideal. If you could lay out all of the best pieces of having a good lead investor and the relationship. The first is actually the relationship. So the chemistry between the partner at the lead investor that's sitting on your board and helping provide you guidance, the chemistry between that person and your team is critical. If that chemistry is bad, then it will not only be an unsatisfying experience for everybody, it can be destructive to the company. So you want to make sure you see eye to eye on strategy, and also you see eye to eye in terms of the way you solve problems, how you work through crises, because you really are going to spend a lot of time with your lead investor. So the chemistry within the relationship, to me, is always first. Second is the skill level of that lead investor, and in particular, the skill level in your domain. So how well do they know your domain? How much history do they have investing in your domain? And because they hopefully can provide you guidance from that, so you can look at their past investments as an indication in your space, as an indication of that. And then, the third piece would be, what does their network look like? And how can they help you in a couple of regards? One, hiring people. So can they help you? Are they connected to senior people? Do they bring other interesting people into diligence that you feel like are really qualified people that could be helpful to you down the road? And then also, are they connected to potential partners, customers, depending on the sector? And so the network of the VC matters. So those are some of the ideal characteristics. In reality, you rarely get all of this. And it's not that often that startups, in particular early stage startups, get multiple offers from multiple investors that you can really pick and choose each of these. So in reality, what you want first is a fair set of terms that you feel adequately incent you, but also incents the investor. And you want to feel like they're going to be involved, that they're going to help, because every startup needs help. And so kind of in the real world, I think both terms matter, and then second, how involved are they going to be?
That's great advice. Bill, let's say one of the startups gets a meeting, a first meeting with a VC. What's the best way for the follow-up to happen after that meeting? Or there may be multiple ways depending on what happens in the meeting.
Yeah, I think, focusing on a first venture investment. So a company that's looking for its first investment from an institutional investor. So a seed or a Series A, you're presenting your idea and you're asking for advice and input as much as an investment decision. Because oftentimes, those presentations are not complete and the companies are not really ready for investment. There may be some translational experiments that need to be done where the investors say, boy, that's pretty interesting. But, if you could conduct some version of these experiments to show that it in fact has commercial application or is useful in addressing certain conditions, there's very much a two-way communication as opposed to, are you going to invest or not? So I think follow-up shouldn't be really focused on, are you going to make an investment or not, but do you have any feedback? And I think investors, if approached from that perspective, generally are very forthcoming. And, if you get crickets and they're not answering and you're ghosted, just move on. But generally, most investors that are talking to early stage founders are interested in providing, meaningful and actionable feedback, even if they're not willing to invest right away. If they are willing to invest, then there's a long discussion. But to follow up, I think from the perspective of, what else can we do? What questions do you have? Is probably the best way to do that and not expect a thumbs up or a thumbs down after one meeting.
Great.
Kirsten, before we move on to some other questions, it occurred to me there's a question that's kind of not in the things we've received in advance that might be helpful here about kind of the upfront relationship between a founder and investor. And in particular, where we have problems sometimes. So when you're an investor, you want to know as much as you can in kind of a straightforward, transparent way. And sometimes we interact with founders who are reluctant to share what they're really doing. They're very cautious about privacy and about sharing their invention. And a couple of things happen when founders are overly cautious. One, they might get wrapped up too early in requiring an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. And in particular, the tech world is a little different than the life science world in this regard. In the life science world, and Bill, you could comment, pretty much every life science VCS included signs NDAs to get deeper information. It's not always true on the tech side. So if you're a tech founder, say requiring an NDA up front might actually shut down a bunch of investor conversations that you could otherwise enable. And so I wouldn't recommend that. But the other thing is sometimes we'll have a call with a founder where they will be fairly untransparent about what their innovation really is and how they're doing something. And we'll get off that phone or out of that meeting and we'll say, it's just too hard to figure out what's really going on. We don't have a founder who's really being transparent. We don't know that we ever can figure it out. And so we'll move on to other opportunities where we can. So I would encourage founders to be transparent, like put it out there. In most cases, anyone who wants to figure out what you're doing can figure it out anyway. And don't be cautious about sharing.
I think following up there a little bit, I think you should have a presentation that doesn't require a CDA. I mean, I should be able to sit down with the founder and have some idea of what they're doing and why it's important and why I want to learn more without having to get into any secret sauce or disclosures or anything that would create anxiety. You can describe targets without identifying targets. You don't have to give people chemical structures. And, we will just assume, and VCs will assume that there's something there. And if it's interesting enough, then they'll execute a CDA and dig in and do a much deeper dive than you really want. But you should be able to present your idea to someone not only succinctly, but also without getting into anything that's truly proprietary. There are exceptions, but I think most of the time we should be able to have a conversation without the need for a CDA.
And I think part of the question here too is about founder-led companies versus other models, venture creation model. And I was curious about how OUP then views these founder-led companies, which actually are quite common in the university space, at least initially. Marc, do you want to take that?
Sure. We do invest in founder-led companies, and so it really depends on a couple of things. Number one, some dynamics around first, what we think of the founder. Are they skilled, frankly, in what they do? And second, what the dynamics are of long-term, how that founder views their role. And so let me hit that second piece first. We are hesitant to invest in a founder-led company, in particular, an academic founder-led company, where the academic says, I'm determined to be the CEO long-term here. Like I'm very talented, I've built a big lab, I know how to run a lab, I'm going to be able to know how to run a company, and I am the long-term CEO. And I've overstated what we hear, that message, but we hear various flavors of that message. And that for us is concerning, because every CEO, whether they're an academic founder or experienced, skilled CEO, they wind up in situations where they can operate successfully and situations they can operate unsuccessfully. And we never want that to be a barrier to success. So where an academic founder thinks that they can learn it all, learn entrepreneurship, that makes us nervous, because entrepreneurship is extremely hard and it's different than being a principal investigator. So that's a big negative for us. A positive, to turn that into a positive, would be where a founder says, I don't know if I'm the right long-term CEO, and I'm willing to try, I'm interested in trying, I want to learn, I want to get feedback from you. I've surrounded myself with great advisors, industry advisors, people who know the startup world, and I'm willing to give it a try. And if it doesn't work out, I want to have an open dialogue about that. And it might not work out 6 months from now or 2 years from now. I'm happy to step aside, because what matters to me is creating equity value, having my equity be valuable. That's much more important than me being CEO. And when we hear that, then we're very willing to engage with the founder, and we're very willing to back a founder. And sometimes those founders wind up staying CEO the entire time, and they're very successful. Other times they don't. But if you have that open dialogue along the way, then hopefully it works out well for everybody.
Great. And Bill, I'm just going to shoot this one to you, and then we'll move on to another category of questions. If the founder is not the PI, but instead a postdoc or a grad student who developed the tech, any different thoughts on there?
No, not really. I think what Marc said still pertains. I think, from our perspective, we're entrusting our capital to a management team. And even in the earliest stages, we want to be sure that individual, though they may be very talented in the lab setting, it's not clear that they really are necessarily talented at putting together an early stage company. And, one thing we see is that drug discovery, biologic discovery, is very different than drug development. And there are very experienced people out there who have done drug development, taking discoveries through development into clinical candidates and on into clinical studies. And that is an experience set, an experience that's required to do that correctly and efficiently. And generally a postdoc coming out of a lab, although they may have the institutional knowledge of the technology or the science, they rarely have true robust drug discovery and development expertise, and taking that lab discovery on into a molecule or a therapeutic that can enter the clinic. So it's pretty rare that we would back a postdoc as CEO for very long.
All right.
But we do like to see postdocs go into companies. We like to see that transfer of talent from a lab.
To be clear, it's rare that a PI running a large lab is going to leave their day job and roll into a company full time, although it does happen. But as Marc said, what we do like to see are individuals from that lab that have that institutional knowledge and that liaison back to the PI join the company full time. And that's very common in biotech.
All right, great. We're going to move on to questions now on VC decision making. So Marc, what do VCs look for in customer traction and validation in tech?
Yeah, and again, I'll answer it tech, and we should ask the same question for life science.
Sure.
So first, it does depend on the stage. And so in tech, any venture investor is very cognizant of what stage are you at and what traction and validation should you have at that point. I would say in all cases, whether you're at a pre-seed round just getting started, or a seed round, or a Series A round, or later, investors are looking for signals. So think about the words, think about customer traction and validation, not as mattering in and of themselves, but mattering as a signal to an investor that there is something interesting going on, that you've built a product that the market wants, that you're in an interesting space. And so what we're looking for as investors are signals. And so let me kind of talk about the kinds of signals we look for that get us interested. The starting point when you're just getting started, we're looking for who joined your team and what are their backgrounds and why did they join. There are signals there, one about what they think about the management team, but also in particular if they have industry expertise, if they have deep domain expertise in the area you're developing a company, like that signal is interesting to us. What do they know about their area? Let's say they work in photonics somewhere else and they're joining a photonics startup. That's interesting to us of why did they join, and we'll try to ferret that out. So that's at the very earliest stage. And then we're interested in your customer discovery conversations, in particular as they get to proof of concept and pilots with potential companies and customers, even if they're unpaid. And because there's a signal there, why did they do it? And we'll go talk to them. Similarly, advisory board members, and why are they joining and how are they helping? So there's some interesting signals there. So then to be concrete, if you're at a pre-seed level, there are very few of these signals, but hopefully you'll have had a bunch of interactions with customers. Maybe you pulled a rudimentary team together. If you're at a seed round, most companies at a seed round today have some pilots going on. They're generally unpaid, but they've got maybe an alpha product and some pilots. By the time you get to a Series A round, companies these days have revenue. Maybe they'll have 500,000 or $1 million of revenue, and the signals come from that.
Great. Bill, anything you want to add on the life sciences?
Well, for life science, it's most of that is just not available to us, right? Signals, I think, matter, and we have advisory boards. Who's on your advisory board to the extent you're building a team, but it's rare that a life science company, even a diagnostic or device company, is going to have meaningful revenue or traction in the marketplace. So we look for other signals that Marc, I think, alluded to, and I don't need to repeat. And then, the question really is more a matter of how attractive is the opportunity? What are the unmet needs really look like? And how does your technology meet those needs? And it's something that just takes a lot longer to develop to the point where you actually have tangible evidence of that.
And we got another question in that I'm gonna reword. Just how large, what kind of role does the intellectual property play in what you're evaluating? And Bill, I'll go with you first on that one.
So it's critical. On the other hand, it's very secondary to our initial discussion. It's one of the pitfalls, I think, early stage companies and CEOs, founders focus on is we'll spend a lot of time on their patent. And the fact is that we assume in the initial discussion that there's IP, and we will assume that there's freedom to operate, which is even more important than having a defensive position. And we will just put that on the back burner as a diligence item we will get to eventually. But it's not something we spend a lot of time on upfront. And I think it's a pitfall, if we get into pitfalls, that when you're presenting to VCs to focus and spend a lot of time on your patent, because we have lots of companies we've invested in where the initial IP is not even relevant to the final product, or that the initial IP turns out to run into FTO issues, and we collectively as a company work around that. So I would have an answer to the IP question if you get it, but most investors will put that off and deal with it later once they've decided that, hey, you have an interesting technology, there's a really unmet need that you're solving, and it's an efficient way to solve it. And, they'll assume you have some IP in place. And if you don't, then it'll kind of die there. But I think it's overemphasized. by early stage companies and founders relative to the venture investment decision.
Marc, anything you want to add on that? If not,
Yeah, I'd say it's helpful. Like the first thing is in both tech and life science, like you need to have freedom to operate. So that can knock you out. And outside of having freedom to operate, having a strong IP portfolio is sometimes enabling for what you want to do, and sometimes helps create like a competitive moat for you, but it never drives the success of the business. What drives the success is like, are you focused on the right target? And do you have a druggable target? Or do you have a software product that customers want to buy? And intellectual property never enables any of that. And we have both seen companies and occasionally invested in companies that boasted heavily about their IP portfolio. And in some ways it got in the way, like if you're too, as Bill said, if you're too IP oriented, it kind of gets in the way of what really makes a startup successful.
Yeah. And one thing I'll just point, someone else mentioned in the questions that universities themselves usually don't do FTOs, which we do realize. It's just that when the company's looking at the IP, they're going to be looking at the freedom to operate. So one more question on customer discovery, Marc, that came in. Are there aspects of customer discovery that make it credible to VCs versus just the founder saying, I talked to a bunch of customers and they seem excited about it? So
I really like this question. So thank you for asking it. So I would say we often hear that I talked to a bunch of customers and they liked it, and it does not bring a lot of weight to us. And I'll go to the extreme. And I'll point at kind of the I-Core approach. I-Core is a wonderful program. And so we have benefited from I-Core, and we've invested in a number of companies that went through I-Core. But when people hear the I-Core kind of message is go talk to 50 or 100 customers and hitting that number, you talk to 50 potential customers or 100 potential customers, and just like that metric, they get wrapped around it too much. And that is meaningless to us. So we've had founders come in and say, I went and talked to 50 customers and they all loved it. I went through the I-Core program and they all loved it. And we're like, well, what did they like about it, of your product? What are the things they didn't like about it? How would it work within their architecture? And so what really matters is not talking to a lot of customers. What matters is going deep with a few customers. And so what matters more to us in fundraising conversations with our startups is when you get actual engagement with a potential customer and you have 3 or 4 meetings with them, even if they're not using the product, where you've done a deep review, they've done a deep demo, they've done an architectural review, and you're getting feedback from them and listening to what matters from them. And it's helpful to do that with multiple customers, because any one customer may give you a unique answer. And 3 customers may give you 3 unique answers, but that's better than 1. So going deep with a few customers is much, much better than just having superficial conversations with many potential customers.
Okay, great. Thanks. We're going to keep on this VC decision-making and we're interacting with VCs theme here, but we're going to move on to a very topical question. Is many VCs have become comfortable with making investment decisions after meeting exclusively over Zoom. Is this going to be a trend? Is this a fad, or what do you see, Bill?
It's interesting because if you go back to March, or whenever shutdown occurred in 2020, we internally thought, wow, there's just no way we could ever make an investment first meeting a company over Zoom. And that's obviously come 180 degrees. And we've now made many investments with simply virtual interaction with teams. And I think it's not a trend, a fad. I think it's going to be a meaningful part of venture activity going forward. I think it provides a number of advantages. Typically we'd meet in person. We'd go visit a company, they'd come to our office, they'd bring some subset of the team and present, and it would be that interaction, maybe with some phone calls and follow-up. And now, we've got this via Zoom, we can interact with the entire team, and we can interact with specific members of the team in follow-on conversations and have much greater frequency of contact with specific members of the operating team or the management team over time. And, other than having to visit a physical plant to be sure it exists or that it's got, requisite characteristics to, be a part of the operating plan, that really doesn't matter to most of the companies we look at. Most of our tech companies are not really physical plants, and in the biotech area, most work is outsourced to CROs. So there's not really a site visit requirement like there may be in other businesses. So I think for a lot of reasons, we're going to see Zoom continue to play a critical role in the diligence process, the initial meeting and the ongoing diligence, and even follow-up with companies. I think once we make an investment, most of these companies have board meetings quarterly, sometimes every 6 weeks or 8 weeks, but quarterly. And in most cases, it's evolved to, well, let's do 2 by Zoom and 2 in person and save the flying time. So I think it's here to stay.
Yeah, that's and we don't want to be exclusionary. We're talking about Teams too, and Google Meet, or however these meetings occur.
Virtual interaction.
Virtual interactions. Right.
And I think it'll only get better over time, and eventually we'll all meet in the metaverse. So it won't matter.
Right. All right, Marc, I'm gonna, for our next question, I'm actually gonna amend it because of another question that came in. So
Kirsten, can I intercept you for a minute and just talk about a couple of other aspects about Zoom? And by the way, my computer seems to be blinking in. Can you still see me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I can't see you, but that's fine. There are some benefits about Zoom that I think are also here to stay that you should be ready for as you're fundraising. Number one, things move much faster now. So because we're not beholden to in-person meeting schedules, you can get calls set up right away. You can do diligence right away. And investors expect it more. So our pace of investments have sped up. Our pace of diligence has also sped up. So be prepared to have things move quickly. The second thing is I actually think it's a little bit easier to have an introductory discussion. If you're a startup raising capital, it's a little bit easier to engage a venture investor to get them to have a 15-minute Zoom call with you now than it used to be to have an in-person meeting. And so use that to your advantage, where you can get on people's calendars for very short calls, get a chance to get in front of them. And so it opens more doors from a fundraising standpoint than the in-person one. Sorry, Kirsten, I interrupted your flow.
Sorry, no, that's quite all right. That was great. We're all going to have some technical difficulties here. And Marc, my next question is to you, and we can still see you fine, just FYI. This goes in is a question about first rounds of financing. And so actually, before I ask the question I was going to ask, one of this is, can you just quickly explain the difference between VC and angel investors? And then for those first financing rounds, can you talk about the different structures that you often see with financing rounds, seed rounds, safe, bridge loans, et cetera, and the pros and cons?
Okay, so first to talk about the difference between VC and angel investors. That distinction has gotten closer. There's less difference today than there used to be. Historically, what it meant was that you had individual investors who were angel investors, and they would generally fund the first round of a company. And so most companies that raised the first round of capital did so not with institutional investors, but with angel investors who were usually individuals, and maybe they would invest $250,000 in a company and you'd raise capital from 6 of them. And that was kind of in the earlier venture days, how companies got funded early on. And then venture investors were institutions that had funds, and we would then come in at, let's say, the second round of capital. It's merged now where you have institutional venture investors like us investing just as early as those angel investors. And also you have more funds that are designated as pre-seed funds, designed to be there right from the start. So at the very early stages, there are more sources of capital now. Angel investors are still there. There are also very small pre-seed funds or regional funds, and sometimes there are larger institutional investors. So I don't think the difference matters that much. When you're fundraising for your first round, you kind of want to engage everybody. You want to try to engage some early stage venture firms and seed stage VCs, and you also want to engage some angels. So that's the distinction there. And then the second question, which is kind of the different forms of ways you could raise capital. Do I have that right, Kirsten, between like a safe or a note or a price round?
Loan, yeah, right, yeah.
Or a loan. So I'll separate that into two general kinds of structures. One would be a price round. And so that would be where you sell stock at $1 a share, and the value of the company, it assigns a certain value to the company. You look at all the shares that are outstanding and you apply $1 to share to it, and you say this company is worth $5 million or $20 million or $100 million. And so most institutional investors, whether they're kind of really early stage investors, such as a pre-seed fund or a larger institutional investor, will prefer a priced round. And they want to know what price they're investing in when they first invest in a company. And so when we're investing, that is generally what we are doing. So that's how a priced round works. Now, there's another category of investment where you would put terms like a convertible loan or convertible debt or a safe note or other structures where you're not pricing the company up front. You're not valuing the company up front. You tend to see that more with angel investors than with other investors, but not always. And the reason a company and an investor will agree to do it is they're not sure what the company's really worth. And what the structure of those investments allow is you say, we're going to invest now in either a convertible note or a safe note, and you can pretty much use those interchangeably. And when you raise your next round 12 months from now, our money will convert into that round. Let's say you raise a Series A round 12 months from now, we'll convert into that round at a 25% discount to that price. So we'll get a discount to a future price as opposed to a fixed price today. And what it does is it makes it much easier to fundraise, and without having to haggle over valuation. So those are the two general structures. I would say that a convertible note structure or safe note structure that is unpriced is pretty favorable to companies, to startups. So if you're able to raise capital that way and invest that capital and then raise money a year or 18 months later at a higher price, that's to your benefit and reduces the amount of dilution. And so they're pretty company favorable terms. And if your investors will enable that, that's great. And it's the inverse of that, why venture investors often don't want to do that when they're first investing in the company. They want to know we're investing at a certain price today and our money goes in, and then we're aligned to try to create as much value from there going forward.
Great. Bill, I'm going to ask my next question to you, which is one from our audience. And this is actually about giving the terms. Do the VCs give the terms first when they're looking to lead a round?
Yes and no. I think it's a red flag when the company offers terms. When a company in their presentation, offers up a financing opportunity at a certain price, and often that comes with projected outcomes and how that's a good price because on the back end you make a lot of money. That's generally poorly received by investors. The idea is, the VCs are in the business of trying to assign valuation to companies. That's really what we do. And, we'll take the presentation, we'll do our diligence, and then we'll come back. And it's a negotiation. It's not a take it or leave it. But I think the initial structure of the company, whether it's a single financing or it's tranched with certain milestones and where the valuation is, what the option pool looks like, you're planning to hire a team, you need shares and options available to do that. That's all part of a term sheet. And generally the VCs will offer that up initially in consultation and discussion with the company, but it's generally not expected or typical for a company to do that.
Great. And then the next question is about Series A rounds and kind of what is the general bar? And I think this is really to do with where the technology and the startup are at. What's the general bar for a Series A round? And Bill, I'll have you start with this one, then go.
It obviously it depends, but there are a few guidelines, and it's evolving over time. In life science now, we're seeing $100 million Series A rounds followed by a crossover and an IPO occasionally. So there's really outliers, but traditionally, when a technology is emerging from an academic lab, there are a few things that you want to do before you really do a formal Series A, or if you do a formal Series A, you may take a small tranche as a first tranche to answer some questions. One is replicating the critical experiment in a more robust commercial facility. So not in the founder's lab, but at a CRO. Because for better or worse, and for a variety of reasons, laboratory results don't always replicate, and you're not going to really want to put a lot of money into a company and start a discovery process until you feel confident in the seminal discovery itself. So that's probably one thing you want to do before you raise a Series A. The other is the concept of translational experiments. So taking the initial finding that was discovered in a lab, and there's usually some assumptions around how that is useful in addressing a variety of unmet clinical needs or technical problems, and then what experiments can you do to verify and validate that, in fact, this technology does have the ability to answer some of these questions. So these translational experiments are generally worked out in conjunction with investors. Sometimes the Series A investors will tell the PI, look, here are a couple experiments we'd really like you to do in your lab. And, depending on how they turn out, we'll go ahead and put a Series A together. So usually it's for life science, it's collecting specific experimental data that gives the investors greater confidence, number one, in the underlying seminal discovery, and also its translatability to a more commercial clinical application.
Great. Marc, do you want to answer the same for tech?
Yeah, if it's a Series A round, specifically where you've already raised capital before, and even if you haven't, you need revenue. Like that's for most tech companies, that is what you need. And let me carve out that there are certain sectors of tech where actually your product development cycle is so long, 5 to 10 years, that it's impossible to have revenue. In quantum computing or other areas, and so there, what you need is kind of technical progress on your product, and ideally you would have some collaborations with potential future customers to indicate that companies are interested in what you're doing. So it all comes back to looking for signals.
Okay, great. So we had a couple of questions come in about valuation, and so one of those is, shouldn't you be prepared to talk about the valuation of your company? And so, when you're actually talking with investors at that point. Bill, do you want to answer about the question about discussing valuation and how that's?
No, it's an important question, and people handle it in lots of different ways, some more effective than others. In venture capital, particularly early stage seed Series A investing, valuation is a bit of an art. And the way that we and most venture investors approach this is start at the end. If this is successful, and if this therapy, I'll stick with life science, if this therapy for a certain condition actually works, how many patients have the condition? What is a reasonable price to charge for the therapeutic? And you start to develop a market model for what, peak sales might look like, what the technology might be worth, what the company might be worth in success. And then from there, we back up and say, okay, well, what is it going to take to get to that point? Because most of these companies exit after phase 2B data, where there's, they're not going to take it through pivotal registrational trials. It's just too expensive. That's usually done in the hands of an acquirer. So we go back and say, okay, at what point do we think this company could transact? And usually it's a generalization, but usually it's phase 2B. So it shows efficacy against standard of care in patients with a particular clinical condition. And then we decide, okay, what could it be worth if it's successful in that setting at that time? And then how much money is it going to take to get from where we are today, which is a discovery in the lab, to a phase 2B trial success? And how would we meter that over time? How many rounds of financing might it take? And if it's going to be worth, say, $1 billion, just to pick a round number at phase 2B with positive data, well, that's got to generate what kind of multiple return for the investors that funded the phase 2 study. And let's say it's 3x or 4x, you can kind of back into, okay, well, that's worth 250 million before it starts the phase 2B. And then, well, okay, if the investors that funded the phase 1 studies and the initial clinical studies to get to a phase 2 need 5x because it's riskier, or 6x, you can start to move back and say, okay, well, then 250, you've got to get to 5x. It's a $50 million valuation. And pretty soon you're back at your Series A, which is what price can I pay today so that in future financings, as we raise the money we need to get to an exit at a reasonable valuation, as we step back through these financings to today, what can we pay for the company so that our return, our risk-adjusted return, is appropriate? And so it's a really back to front process. There's no magic to it. And so when companies say, well, we think we're worth 50 million because some other company is worth 50 million, there's got to be some justification for it. And it's a dialogue that we have all the time with these companies. But that's how the venture community does it. We start at the back end and then work our way down to where we are at the time of the discussion.
Yeah.
And it's so.
Yeah. So it's definitely not a one size fits all. It's very dependent on the company, its stage, what it's done so far, et cetera, what it's raised already. Marc, I'm going to address the next question to you, which is what potential size of market is too small for VCs, or how big do you need to have as your potential market?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before I answer, let me just do a sound check. I understood my voice got way too loud a minute
and now
ago.
it's way too soft.
Now it's way too soft.
Okay. Well, I don't know. And how is it now?
That's good.
Yeah,
All
that's
right.
good.
That's
So
a
yell
Goldilocks.
at me if I get too loud. I get yelled at home when I'm too loud. What market size is too small? And I think that there is a different answer in tech and life science on that. On the tech side of the investing world, most tech investors, OUP included, are looking to invest in companies that can be massively valuable, that they can be big companies. And so market size is really important in that regard. And so $1 billion market is generally too small. And the reason why is because when you have $1 billion opportunity, in most cases, you don't assume you're going to get 50% of the market. You assume you're going to get 10% or 20% of the market. So that leads to a $100 or $200 million business. And let's imagine we're selling a company when it gets to that point. That company needs to have very large growth prospects ahead of it to be able to command a premium valuation at the sale of the company. So you need to be, you could be great to have a company that's generating 100 or 200 million of revenue, but it needs to be on its way to 400 or 500 million of revenue. And you can't do that in $1 billion market. And so usually, while there's no hard answer, usually the smallest market we would invest behind is about $2 billion. And what you really want to believe, even then, is you can expand that market opportunity to 5 billion or 10 billion. So as you get into north of 5 billion, then you're generally okay from a market size standpoint. Below 2 billion is where it gets to be a little bit of a problem. But on the life science side, the thought process is similar, but has some different dynamics. So Bill, you should talk about that in particular for a therapeutic.
Yeah, I think for life science, it is a little different. It's generally, for some of the companies we invest in where it's a new target, a new biology, there's not this discussion that, well, it's a 500 or $1 billion market and you'd have 5 or 10% of it. It's a little more of a winner take all approach. Also, there's a life cycle for a new therapeutic, and there's this concept of you build sales over time, there's a little plateau, and then they drop off as new technologies are discovered. So there's kind of a peak sales, and some formulaic ways of coming up with what a value is for a specific market. But what's also important is, a lot of the therapeutics that we see that are emerging from university and academic labs today are focused on like specific genetic mutations or gene therapies or cell therapies that really are addressing ultra orphan patient populations. So even if you have 100 patients with a disease, particular disease that you know if you treat it with a particular therapeutic, there's a very, very high likelihood of a life-changing impact. Those therapeutics can be reimbursed at very high dollar values. And so you can build a very attractive market around a relatively small number of patients as long as the efficacy is there. So the way that we look at investing when we think about end market opportunities and how much companies can be worth, there's the initial size of the market based on the patient population and what we think you can charge per patient. And that can vary dramatically depending on how efficacious and what the life impact is and how long the durability might be. And then the question is, what's the competitive landscape look like? And so the combination of the two gives us the inputs we need to kind of calculate what an exit value is. And then for a lot of these life science companies, there's the pipeline or platform opportunity. So the discovery has lots of applications. The company is developing a lead indication, a lead therapeutic for one given clinical condition. But the fact is that, hey, if it works, there are a series of other applications that we can develop in follow-up that have potentially even larger dollar figures associated with it. So the question, if you have a pipeline, you have a platform, how do you value these less developed kind of follow-on opportunities? And that can really vary the exit value of a company pretty dramatically depending on how supported or unsupported those pipeline projects are.
Great, thanks, Bill. Next question for you, Marc. What information should be in a data room for a university-based startup?
Yeah, let me start with what should not be the majority of the data room. Sometimes people say, yeah, we've got a data room, and they send us a link, and it's all legal documents. And when we're accessing a data room, it's because we want to learn about the opportunity. We want to learn about the technology, the product, if they're selling, if they have commercial discussions, their pipeline. And so having a data room that's predominantly legal documents is very unhelpful and frankly a waste of time. So I would not do that. If it's a tech company, what you want to cover are a lot of the things we've mentioned. So your technology, your product, and your product roadmap. So what is your product today, and how do you want to see it evolving over the next 24 months? And that in particular is helpful for us, not because it's necessarily going to be right, but it actually helps us understand where the product is today. If we know where you're going, then it's an easier way for an investor to say, okay, this is what your product has today, what you built today, and what you need to build. So that's really important. Market sizing. So it's one thing to say you need to be in a $3 billion market. The second question is, how do you calculate it? And how do you know? In most of these opportunities, you're often creating a new market. So how you go about market sizing is really helpful. And then finally, a financial model for a tech company, because we view that as information for how you're thinking about things like pricing, what's your go-to-market strategy. There's a bunch of information that's communicated in a financial model. How big an opportunity do you think you can build? We know whatever financial model you have is going to be wrong. It's going to be wrong by a lot, but it helps us understand the quality of the thinking of the management team and their strategy. So those are the things on the tech side we would want. But life science data rooms are very different. So Bill, fill that in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a lot of the same relevant points. I think in the life science, biotech, biopharmaceutical company data room, there's going to be a lot of the original literature that supports the idea, both published by the PI's lab, and then in any predecessor literature that supports what they're doing. But I think sometimes what we see is the data room is so laser focused on that particular discovery, they ignore the broader landscape. What is the standard of care? How has it evolved over time? Where is it going? What are the competitors to the development or the technology that particular company is putting forward? And I think the broader the data room is, I think it conveys to the investors that, hey, this is a thoughtful team that realizes these are all issues that need to be addressed and they're trying to address them. To have regulatory information in there, how is this likely to find its way through the FDA? What kind of study do you need to do to get this done? How much money is it going to cost? How many patients do you think you need? Is it a study that's going to require 1,000 patients or 100 patients? And why do you think that? And in pricing, what do we think the market can bear? What are the standard of care reimbursed today? And why is this worth more? And how would you go about ascertaining that? What do you need to support those contentions? So to really wrap the fundamental scientific discovery in many layers of more nuanced consideration of the opportunity as a company and an investment is really important. Some of that you won't have, but I think to the extent you can find it or at least start to address it, it goes a long way toward convincing investors that, yeah, this is a thoughtful team, not just a great scientist.
Great.
I'm going to add one other thing on top of what Bill said and I said, that almost no startup ever does, with a few exceptions. And I think about this because when we fundraise, when OUP fundraisers from institutional investors for our funds, we create data rooms also. And very few companies give you a guide to the data room. And so most companies, when they give us data room access, we see 10 folders and 1 million documents behind them. And you've got to kind of sort through them all to figure out what matters. And every once in a while, a company will give you a guide to say, here are the 3 things that really matter, and here's where to find them, and here's where everything else is. And it just saves time. So when we create our data rooms for investors, we try to do that. Say, these are the documents we think you really care about. And for startups, I would encourage you to do the same thing. So make sure it's easy to find the few documents that really matter and that they don't get lost in the sea of 100 other things.
And maybe one other comment is that I've seen done very effectively is to have a couple layers in your data room. So you may have a layer that any investor can access that doesn't require a CDA and gives investors some level of information and insight into your company. And then you can have a deeper layer if you're concerned about proprietary information that investors, once they've got through that first layer and have done some work, say, yeah, we're really interested, we'll sign a CDA and we can get into the inner sanctum. And so having that first layer gets back to something Marc mentioned much earlier, which is when you first engage with an investor, you can't be too secretive. You really want to have something you can disclose about what you're doing just to see if somebody's interested or not. Eventually, they'll sign a CDA to get into the secret sauce, but you could structure the engagement in a way that they can learn as much as possible without really requiring a CDA or you're divulging super proprietary confidential information.
And Kirsten, I'm going to keep blocking you for asking your next question. Keep going, because there are a bunch of things that Bill and I are saying implicitly that we haven't said explicitly, and I think is worthy of saying, which is if you're a founder of a company, you are always selling. Like selling what you're doing matters in everything you do. When you're presenting at a conference, you're selling your technology. When you're creating a data room, you're selling. When you're pitching VCs, when you're asking for feedback. And so you do have to, it is a different kind of mindset when you're starting a company that's going to have to raise capital. When you're hiring people, you're always selling. And some of the times when we don't back a founder or an entrepreneur, it's because we think they're not a good salesperson. And it's unfortunate in a way because they may be very good technically, but at the end of the day, a CEO of a business and the senior management team has to be good at selling. And so whatever it is you're doing with a startup, keep that in mind, that you're always selling and you need to position things, make it easy for investors, and just never forget that.
Great. Well, that actually leads me very nicely probably into our next area.
I just have one thing to say though.
Okay.
And I have one thing to say.
I would temper Marc's comments a little bit because we have come away from interactions saying, boy, that founder, that CEO is just too salesy. So you don't want to be so focused on selling that you lose credibility, particularly in these companies we're looking at, which are based on really seminal scientific discoveries. I want to know, what do your competing labs think about your work? right? A lot of this work is done in academic labs that are focused in areas where there are other academic labs at other institutions working on. And, those PIs may have a point of view on, Professor Singer's work. That guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's like focused on the wrong area. Here's a fundamental assumption he's making that's incorrect. And I think for a founder to basically, be willing to lay out the good, the bad, and the ugly, like, here's what I think, and here's why it's important. Here are some objections people have to it and why they're not valid. But I think to be too salesy and to just always be positive and not acknowledge that, yeah, we don't have all the answers or we have some problems we need to work through, you can lose credibility if you overdo it. That's my only caveat.
All right, great. Well, let's keep on the people topic then. And Marc, are VCs more interested in people or technology?
Yeah, it's a binary question, but there's no binary answer.
Yeah.
And so you need both. And if you look, there's a bunch of academic data that is retrospective, where some researchers have asked venture investors in hindsight, if you think about your successful companies, what drove the success? Was it people, technology, product? And people are number one. And similarly, ask the same question, think about your failed investments. What was what factor was most responsible for the failed investments? And again, people were number one. So in reality, I think people matter more than anything else in terms of success or failure. When it comes to motivating somebody to invest, people are an important part, but not all of the story. And the balance of how much kind of people matter versus technology versus product, market, competition, it changes between tech and life science. So within OUP, we debate this all the time, because on the tech side, we do put people first. It's not everything, but at the end of the day, we would rather invest in a great team and average technology than great technology with an average team. Because a great team will figure out how to take average technology and turn it into a great product. And so we are on the tech side of OUP, we're extremely people focused. On the life science side, to speak for Bill, like, it's a little more balanced between those two, because the science is often what drives success there. So Bill, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
No, I think that's right. I mean, you can't overcome fundamentally flawed science. And the fact is that if the people involved in our initial investment decision at an early stage will likely change over time as the company develops. So most companies go through 3 CEOs during their trajectory. There's a founding CEO who's pulling the pieces together and getting the discovery underway and getting early financing in place. And then you get more into a development CEO who's taking that initial work and putting it into a more rigorous, call it drug development protocol, moving toward clinical candidates, setting up clinical trials. And then eventually you get into a more experienced CEO who's looking at commercialization efforts and what needs to be done for a pivotal series of trials and registration, more of a BD focus. And sometimes it's the same person who evolves through all 3 roles, but rarely. And, from our perspective, if the fundamental science is good, one of the jobs of a venture board and venture investors is to make sure that we match the right people with the right technology. So we'll make those changes if we have to over time.
And going into that, I mean, what should an academic founder look for in their business partner / CEO? Marc, do you want to go with that one first?
Yeah, there are a bunch of things that are, in some ways, have some similarities to what you look for in a lead investor, but they are different. So first, you want a true partner, like the chemistry between the academic founder and your business partner, and if that business partner is going to be a CEO, is really important. That you can speak honestly, that you complement each other, you can disagree well, and problem solve well. So the chemistry is really important. Beyond that, there are a bunch of aspects that are very similar to how OUP evaluates CEOs. So if you're thinking about bringing on a partner who is a true CEO, what you need to do is be extremely thorough in your evaluation of that person. And at OUP, we've given several talks around how we go about evaluating CEOs and how you can go about evaluating CEOs. And we can put in the chat here a link to one of those talks if you're interested in watching it. The first step is to really unpeel the onion on who it is you're partnering with. So a lot of times we see people who seem to have great business credentials, and an academic founder will kind of take them at its word, take that person at its word. And when you were to unpeel the onion, they weren't nearly as successful as they projected. And so we spend a lot of time when we're investing behind a CEO, really understanding their track record, what they were good at, what they were not. And it doesn't mean they have to have been universally successful. They may have never been successful, but you want to make sure you want to understand what exactly happened, why, what they learned from it, how are they better for it. And so unpeeling the onion on background is really important in terms of finding a business partner. The second thing on the tech side specifically is if you're developing a product, having somebody with really good product development skills, which are very different than technology skills. And so oftentimes when you have an academic founder, they're really good at technology, but they don't know what product the market will really want. And there's a special skill to actually engage with customers, bring in your technology and figure out how can you build a product that fits their needs, and then how do you price it, how do you package it. And so oftentimes when we're looking in a tech investment to team up an academic founder with an outside business partner, we're looking for someone with excellent product development expertise, because it's very necessary for a successful startup, and often, again, academic founders don't have that. So those are some of the general things that we think about. The last thing I'd say is that having a mediocre first CEO is a problem. And so we see a fair number of opportunities where there is a team between an academic founder and a new CEO, and that new CEO is not great. And oftentimes we get the sense maybe the academic founder knows it. And they thought, this is the best I can get right now, and let me get it, and we'll kind of move the ball forward, and then maybe have a different CEO later. In most cases, I find that's a blocker to a financing, and it's a problem. So we tend to encourage academic founders to not put in place a mediocre business partner. You're better off waiting. Keep the position empty. Serve as interim CEO for a while and hold out until you could find a great CEO, because just a mediocre CEO oftentimes can be destructive to a business. And then, Bill, let me throw it over to you and see what's different on the life science side.
Well, I think most of that still is relevant. I think, as an investor, I would much prefer, this for an early stage company, much prefer a founder that acknowledges that they need help, that, hey, I've got this discovery, I think it has these applications, I'm not experienced in drug discovery and development, can you help as an investor? And most investors that are talking to you at an early stage, and life science investors, have those resources or have access to them to help. So it's much better to leave that role unfilled and ask your potential investor to help you fill it than to just find somebody in your local academic ecosystem and bring them into the company and present kind of a team that may be mediocre or not really great to begin with. So it's better to leave that role unfilled and just reach out to talk to the investor, say, yeah, we need somebody to be a project manager or somebody with drug discovery expertise to help. And we all have lots of individuals that we know who can function in that role part-time as a consultant, and even entrepreneurs who are willing to jump into the right opportunity full-time. But don't hesitate to just say, I don't know where to go next or who to do it with, rather than just picking somebody who says they understand business, because it's a very specific set of skills that you need.
And could you elaborate a little bit more on those skills that are needed?
I'll focus on a life science opportunity where there's a discovery, there's some compelling biology that has applications in a variety of clinical conditions. And the question is it even a drug? I mean, a lot of discoveries don't necessarily equate to drugs. And so how do we take this discovery and start exploring the relevant chemical space, with robust medicinal chemistry and do the right biological experiments in the right settings with the right set of circumstances to convince ourselves and investors that there is a path forward here. And there are a number of things that are pretty standard in drug discovery and development, and then there's an art to it. And there are individuals who've done that many times in the past and are really drug discovery and development experts and focus their activities in that area. And you don't necessarily need someone full-time, but you need that expertise in some capacity. And oftentimes we bring them in as consultants. In our diligence, we'll say, look, we're looking at this opportunity. It's very early. Can you look at it with your drug developer hat on and say, yeah, I see a path forward here? Or, there are some fundamental chemical aspects to what they're trying to do or biological aspects to this that I think are going to make it very, very difficult to go forward and develop a drug. And we want to know that up front. And you should as well. But that's something you can reach out to your investors for help with. You don't have to have that prepackaged.
Great, thanks. Marc, I'm going to ask you a question, one more question that's kind of in the faculty founders area, and then we're going to move on to specific sectors and trends because we're going to be running out of time soon. So I'd love to hear from you, just kind of top pieces of advice you have for faculty founders, and maybe also address some misconceptions that they may have or that you've found when discussing startups with faculty founders.
Misconceptions that the founders themselves have?
Yeah, about being a company founder, excuse me.
Got it, okay. Well, first, let me kind of give pieces of advice, which probably dovetails to some degree with misconceptions. Number one, move fast. So we find one of the challenges of academics turned entrepreneurs is a speed challenge. They're just, being an entrepreneur requires a much, much more significant pace of development, pace of everything. And that's not the normal academic culture, except in some labs and some situations. And so we find sometimes when academics leave and become entrepreneurs and they leave full-time, and become a full-time entrepreneur, it takes them 4 years to get to somewhere where we think a skilled startup team might do it in half the time. And so just move faster than you ever have before. And part of that is you can't really do it well part-time. You could do it part-time. You can definitely be an advisor. You could even be something like a chief technology officer. Maybe you could be an interim CEO for a short period of time, part-time. But to do it for longer than, let's say, 6 months then you don't move fast enough. And so you've got to, if you're really want to do it, you've got to go all in. And it could be on a sabbatical or other areas, but you have to move fast. So that's number one. Number two would be to not let your own kind of pride and ego get in the way, to truly have the mantra of you want what's right for the company and for the value of your equity more than anything else. And so in that, those things come into conflict at a few points. It comes into conflict of whether you hire outside management or not. And so again, sometimes academics want to run the company from a pride standpoint. You may be the most skilled person to do it, and then it's great, but don't have your pride be driving that decision. You want to make a rational decision. Similarly, on raising capital, there's often a question of what valuation do you raise money at, and Bill referred to that earlier. And sometimes pride gets in the way of successful fundraising because a founder will see what another company was valued at when it raised capital, and they say, we're better than they are, so we should get a better price. And they tell the market that, and then they fail in their fundraising. And the reality is you want to get the right partner. And so you want to let things that all relate to ego and pride, just leave them at the door. And you want to do what's best for the ultimate equity value of the business. So those are two. And then the third one I'd say is just be scrappy. And this is an area that academics often excel. Like, try to do as much as you can with as little capital as possible, including if it means don't raise capital at all. And some of the best companies delayed how long they raise capital for. So when we evaluate management teams, we put a lot of stock in the fact if a company has come a long way from a technology development across 3 years and only spend $2 million doing it. And that's an important signal for us that they can be scrappy. So just being scrappy and making every dollar count goes a long way.
Great.
So then,
Bill, anything you want to add to that?
I guess the only other thing is realize when you enter into a venture financing, you're almost certainly going to give up control. And that's control at the board level, voting control. You want to pick your partners carefully, but trying to structure a venture financing where as a founder you maintain control is really hard to do unless you're a serial entrepreneur who's had multiple successful companies and have the leverage to do that. Just realize that even if it's not on day one, but pretty soon after you begin that voyage, you're going to lose control. And so you want to do this with partners where you feel comfortable that you're all on the same page and striving to achieve the same ultimate goal.
Great. All right.
I might have one misconception because you did say talk about misconceptions.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Specific to fundraising, which is that sometimes founders, this doesn't have to be an academic founder, it could be just a startup founder, feel like if they get the right investor, that the investor will truly drive strategy. They in some ways overemphasize the impact the investor will have. And I don't mean to sell OUP and our colleague venture firm short, but the reality is in a startup, the management team they're the drivers. And venture investors are there to provide guidance, advice, provide kind of wisdom from experience. But venture investors first look to the management team to set the strategy, to say, we want to go in this direction. And when you see the inverse, when you see a management team look too much to their investors and too much kind of are order takers from their investors as opposed to leaders, usually there winds up being a problem there in terms of strategy. So don't think once you get the right lead investor, it's going to get a lot easier. Actually, it will probably be equally hard. You'll get good advice, but it's still really on you, the management team, to drive the business.
All right, I'm going to ask some specific sector trends. Bill, with regards to biotech, what spaces right now are currently hot, and can you especially address medtech?
Yeah, so within biotech, there's a lot of things that are hot right now. Merely the question, there's not many areas in biotech that aren't hot right now. I think you've got a lot of cell therapies coming out now, moving from the original CAR T to allogeneic CAR T to in situ CAR T, and manipulating cell surface proteins in various ways. That is, really exciting, really early, but very, very exciting. Gene therapy's obviously been evolving as well, in different ways you can achieve and modulate genes. Epigenetics is very important and evolving, working with both DNA and RNA. RNA therapeutics now are a very hot area. Oligo technology has been around a long time. It is undergoing a bit of a resurgence right now. So it's hard to point out any one area that's super hot because it's all really hot. And I think what investors have come to realize is that the pace of understanding and discovery in the biological sciences is really accelerating at a rate we've never seen before. And the probability of success of many of these therapeutic efforts is much higher than it used to be. It's not a small molecule that you try in thousands of patients and it works in a small percentage. I mean, in general, you've got companion diagnostics or underlying patient identifier technologies that allow you to predict with some measure of certainty where these therapeutics are going to work and how they're going to work, which leads to, much smaller markets, but much more efficacious technology and the ability to charge more. So there's been some really big changes in pricing. I think one of the elephants in the room is who's going to pay for all of this new science and technology, because these are not inexpensive therapeutics. They're expensive to develop, they're expensive to manufacture. And can you really afford as a society to pay for them for everyone in whom they may be indicated? I think that's over the horizon, but it's getting closer and closer, and something that I think as a community, we're going to have to develop a point of view on. In medtech, there's been some resurgence there as well, although it's still a hard road. The regulatory and reimbursement challenges there, I think, are higher than in biopharma, particularly in reimbursement. And it used to be that, medtech would be a shorter road to discovery, but a lower exit valuation. So the multiple and the risk profile, the risk return profile rather, is similar to what we'd see in biotech, which was, hey, it's a long, arduous road, but potentially very valuable at the end. And those have really flip-flopped. I mean, we're seeing companies now with promising platform technologies raising a large Series A, having a crossover round in 18 months, and they're public 2 years from founding with a multi-billion-dollar market cap. And that just never happens in medtech. MedTech is still more of singles and doubles, the occasional triple, whereas in life science now, we're seeing companies founded around really exciting technology, attracting world-class management teams, blue chip investor syndicates, and within 18 months, they're off to the races and public. So I think for MedTech, it's still more of a slog. There are more investors looking at MedTech. There's been more success in MedTech, but it's still, I think, relative to biopharma, for investors, if you have a marginal dollar, it's easier to look toward biopharma and biotech than medtech.
Thanks, Bill. Marc, you want to comment on the tech sector?
Yeah, and first I'd say that there are a number of areas that universities have created companies in the tech realm that have increasingly come into favor recently. So, first on like the hardware and semiconductor side, areas like neuromorphic computing, chip development, quantum computing, a bunch of hardware areas that historically were hard to raise capital for, have become a little bit easier, and there's a lot of investor interest there. Another area that just in the last 6 months has had a resurgence is, what's now called climate tech, previously called clean tech. So lots of energy related opportunities, whether it's fusion or some sectors of batteries or carbon capture. And so we're seeing a resurgence in the climate tech world. Some of that's driven by what's happened with SPACs recently, where a number of kind of later stage companies were able to go public through SPACs at high valuations. And then there are some areas that have always been in favor and continue to be: cybersecurity, where universities do a lot of research, AI-related opportunities. So the software world in general continues to be pretty active.
Great. Bill, is there anything, what is too early for biotech or biopharma, I should say?
I think with the right investor and the right structure, very little is too early. We've seen some very, very early discoveries get funding, and sometimes a lot of funding. So I don't think there's anything that's too early. For most investors, though, you've got to get through that translational work and not just the original seminal discovery, but why is it relevant and how is it relevant, and how can you convince investors that it's relevant to addressing a clinical condition? So there are certain experiments that need to be done, but I don't know that anything is really too early at this point for the right investor.
Yeah.
And that's changed over the last 5+ years.
Great. Well, talking about something else that's changed is we had a question of why do flyover areas exist? Marc, you want to take that one?
Yeah. Well, historically they existed, maybe to say it pejoratively, because investors were lazy. They didn't want to get on airplanes and go to the Midwest or other places if they were in the Bay Area. And Bay Area investors were the extreme of it, where there used to be a lot of very well-known venture capital firms that would say, we will only invest in companies that are based in the Bay Area. And even then, sometimes they wouldn't invest in companies that were too long a drive from Sand Hill Road. Like they wouldn't even invest in a company in Oakland. And so, but I would say a lot of that has changed. It was changing before the pandemic as the venture industry itself got more competitive. And you started to see investors invest internationally and in other markets. And then because of the pandemic and the dynamic of Zoom, I think that the geographic barriers are rapidly disappearing. And so the flyover, what are historically called flyover areas. I think that those distinctions are going to disappear. And if it's a good company, as long as you can get the right connections to the right venture firms, those venture firms are willing to invest anywhere now. And so hopefully 5 years from now, we're not even using the term flyover anymore. And we have much more even spread of where venture dollars go.
The only caveat, and I agree with that Zoom has really changed it and will. The only caveat is where are you going to build your company? And do you have access to the talent locally that you need to build it? So in Boston and in the Bay Area, there's a deep bench of talent in drug development and in biopharmaceutical company development, broadly speaking, right? And so the discovery that's made in a university lab somewhere in the Midwest, you know, as an investor, do I want to build a company in that community where they don't have the infrastructure or the personnel or the talent? Or do we take that technology, license it into a company that we locate in Boston where, you know, you can't walk down the street without running into a whole management team for a biotech company? So I think there's two parts to that. One is discovering technology and finding the discoveries and the inventions elsewhere in the country. I think that will really change dramatically, and already is with Zoom and more of a virtual discovery process. But I think where you're actually going to establish and domicile a company still is going to require access to talent. And that may still drive some of these companies toward the coast, for better or worse.
I think that's true, but I'm also going to argue that that is less true today than it was 2 years ago.
Probably.
Because there are many more virtual companies where you have your senior team spread out, again, because of Zoom. And so like if you're a life science company and you're primarily using CROs, you don't physically need to be in a lab space together. And so if you have the dynamic that you're not doing actual hands-on lab work together, people can be anywhere. And our startups that we're investors in are hiring people without geographic constraints these days and letting them work from home or work remotely. So I think that distinction may disappear also. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath, but
Well, okay, so we have 2 minutes left. We're going to do lightning round. You guys have to answer these questions in 2 sentences or less. Okay, Bill, do we invest in orphan indications?
Yes.
All right. Marc, is it better for a startup to have a license with agreed terms or be able to negotiate financials with investor input?
It doesn't matter. What matters is having the right license in either way. So if you negotiate, I'm not allowed that many words. If you negotiate the right license up front, it'll survive. If it's a bad license up front, it might get renegotiated later. So as long as you negotiate a fair license up front for both sides, you're fine doing it early, or you can wait.
That was 2 sentences, but long. All right. Bill, do you invest in deals led by investment bankers?
Rarely. I mean, generally, the investment banker deals are either very late stage deals, like mezzanine financings raising a lot of money. If it's a private early stage company, the question is, why can't that management team develop its contacts with the venture community on its own?
Great. Marc, for networking, which we talked about early on in this, are technical meetings or business meetings better for the startup for networking, for getting to investors?
It's equal. One is not better than the other.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bill, what is the single most important attribute a startup needs before approaching angels or VCs?
A compelling value proposition.
Excellent. Great. I'm going to ask either of you. We do have a couple of questions that are left on here, so I apologize that we didn't get to all of them. I know one of these questions, for example, is on founders equity, and we actually are planning on another seminar on that. I just want people to know that. We hope to have a founders equity seminar coming up in the near future. First of all, we want to thank all of you for attending. We have provided you a survey in the chat. Please do fill this out. We base our webinars, including this one, was based on an idea that someone provided to us. So please do fill out this survey. Let us know what you think. We apologize that we didn't get to all of the questions. We got a ton of questions. We really appreciate that. we will try to follow up with people with regards to their questions. Anything, Marc or Bill, that you want to add at the very end here, since I know we didn't get to everything?
No, thank you for all the questions. We wish we could be face-to-face with all of you.
Yeah,
Exactly.
hopefully soon. Fingers crossed that will be the case. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Marc and Bill, for your time today. And everyone, enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.